In 1995, the Westwood Towers stood like a glass monument against the Los Angeles skyline, its 27 floors reflecting the amber glow of streetlights that never seemed to sleep. The building housed doctors, lawyers, and entertainment executives who paid premium rent for the privilege of living in one of the city's most prestigious addresses. John Black Bull Smith had earned his nickname not from any aggressive nature, but from his imposing 6'3" frame and the gentle strength he displayed every day as the building's night doorman. At 51, John possessed the kind of smile that could brighten the darkest 3 a.m. lobby, and residents often joked that he knew more about their lives than their own therapist did. His shift began every evening at 11 p.m. sharp, when he would arrive wearing his navy blue winter uniform coat, the one with golden buttons and the Westwood Towers emblem embroidered on the chest. The coat was his pride, always pressed and clean, a symbol of the dignity he brought to his work. John lived in a modest apartment in Inglewood with his wife Rosa and their 12-year-old son Marcus, who had been born with spina bifida and navigated the world from his wheelchair with the same infectious optimism his father displayed. Every morning, John would return home with stories from his night shift, and Marcus would listen with wide eyes as his father described the interesting people who lived in the tall building downtown. The residents of Westwood Towers had grown accustomed to John's presence. He remembered everyone's names, their pets, their schedules, and their preferences. Mrs. Henderson, from the 14th floor, always received help with her groceries. Mr. Yamamoto from the 23rd floor got his newspapers arranged just the way he liked them. John wasn't just a doorman, he was the heartbeat of the building. On November 15, 1995, the autumn air carried an unusual chill through downtown Los Angeles. John arrived for his shift as always, greeting the evening doorman, Carlos, with his characteristic warm handshake and genuine inquiry about Carlos's family. The lobby was quiet, decorated with tasteful fall arrangements that cast long shadows under the crystal chandelier. "Cold night tonight, Carlos?" John said, adjusting his winter coat and checking the brass buttons. "Make sure you bundle up on your way home." Carlos nodded, gathering his things. "Thanks, Bull." Mrs. Peterson in 12B said she's expecting a late delivery, some medical equipment. "I'll take care of it," John replied, settling behind the mahogany reception desk. "Drive safe." As Carlos disappeared into the night, John began his routine. He checked the security monitors, reviewed the evening's visitor log, and prepared for what he expected to be another peaceful night watching over the building's sleeping residents. At 11:47 p.m., John made his first security round, his footsteps echoing softly through the marble corridors. The building felt different that night, quieter somehow, as if it were holding its breath. He checked each floor methodically, ensuring all hallway lights were functioning and emergency exits were clear. By 2:15 a.m., John had returned to the lobby and was reading a paperback novel when the phone rang. It was Rosa, calling as she sometimes did during his quiet hours. "How's my night owl?" she asked, her voice warm with affection. "Just keeping the castle safe," John replied, his smile audible in his voice. "How's Marcus? Did he finish his homework?" "Finally. He wanted to wait up for you, but I convinced him you'd tell him about your night when you get home." "Tell him I'll have extra stories tomorrow," John said. "I love you both." "Love you too, Bull. See you in the morning." That was the last conversation anyone would have with John Black Bull Smith. At 6 a.m., when the morning doorman David arrived for his shift, he found the lobby empty. John's novel lay open on the desk, his coffee cup still half full and lukewarm. His keys, radio, and logbook remained exactly where he had left them, but John himself had vanished without a trace. David called John's name, checked the security office, and searched the basement storage areas. Nothing. It was as if John had simply stepped out of existence, leaving behind only the lingering scent of his cologne and the mystery of his disappearance. The Los Angeles Police Department treated John's disappearance with the routine efficiency reserved for missing persons cases. Detective Maria Santos, a 20-year veteran with tired eyes and an overloaded caseload, interviewed Rosa Smith in the sterile environment of the precinct's family room. Rosa sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her voice barely above a whisper as she described her husband. John never missed work. Never. In 15 years at that building, he was never even late. Something terrible has happened to him. Detective Santos took notes with mechanical precision. "Mrs. Smith, did your husband have any enemies? Financial troubles? Gambling debts?" "Detective, my husband worked 2 jobs to support our family. He drove cars at the Beverly Center during the day and worked nights at Westwood Towers. He didn't have time for trouble, and he certainly didn't have money for gambling. The investigation yielded nothing substantial. Security cameras in the building's lobby had mysteriously malfunctioned between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. that night, a technical glitch that the building's management company couldn't explain. The basement storage areas revealed no signs of struggle, no blood, no evidence of foul play. Residents were interviewed one by one. Mrs. Henderson remembered hearing the elevator around 3:30 a.m., but assumed it was a resident returning late. Mr. Yamamoto had been asleep and heard nothing unusual. The investigation stalled within weeks, becoming another cold case file in Detective Santos's growing collection. Rosa returned to work at the county hospital, but her colleagues noticed the change. The vibrant woman who had once filled the nurse's station with laughter now moved through her shifts like a ghost, mechanically efficient but emotionally absent. At home, 12-year-old Marcus would position his wheelchair by the living room window every evening at 6:30 a.m., waiting for his father's familiar silhouette to appear at the end of their street. "Mama, when is Daddy coming home?" Marcus asked one morning, his young face etched with confusion that broke Rosa's heart. "I don't know, baby," she whispered, kneeling beside his wheelchair. "But we have to keep believing he will." Months turned into years. Rosa celebrated Marcus's 13th birthday alone, setting an extra place at the table that remained untouched. She kept John's clothes in their bedroom closet, his work boots by the front door, his coffee mug in the kitchen cabinet. The house became a shrine to a man who had simply vanished. Marcus grew into adolescence carrying the weight of his father's absence. Other children had fathers who attended school events, helped with homework, and taught them about life. Marcus had memories and an empty chair at every family gathering. He learned to navigate not just the physical world from his wheelchair, but the emotional landscape of abandonment and unanswered questions. The residents of Westwood Towers hired a new night doorman, then another, then another. None possessed John's warmth or dedication. The building's atmosphere changed, becoming more sterile, more impersonal. Residents began to realize they had lost more than a doorman. They had lost the soul of their community. Detective Santos retired in 2003, passing John's file to a younger detective who reviewed it once, made a few phone calls, and filed it away again. The case grew cold, then frozen, then forgotten by everyone except the family that continued to live with its devastating consequences. Rosa aged prematurely, her hair turning gray by 40, deep lines etching themselves around her eyes. She never remarried, never even dated. How could she when John might walk through their front door at any moment? She kept his picture on her nightstand and spoke to it every morning before leaving for work. "I'm still here, Bull," she would whisper. "We're both still here waiting for you." Marcus graduated high school in 2001, then college in 2005, achieving academic success that would have made his father proud. But at every milestone, the empty space where John should have stood felt like a physical wound that refused to heal. By 2010, 15 years after John's disappearance, Rosa had developed a ritual. Every November 15th, she would visit Westwood Towers, standing across the street and staring at the building where her husband had vanished. The current doorman, a young man named Kevin, had heard the story from longtime residents and would nod respectfully when he saw her there. The building management had changed hands twice since 1995. New owners, new policies, new security systems. But in the basement storage areas, among forgotten furniture and discarded belongings from former tenants, something waited in the darkness, a piece of the puzzle that would remain hidden for another decade. Marcus, now 27 and working as a computer programmer, had learned to live with the absence, but he never stopped wondering. Late at night, when the world was quiet, he would research missing persons cases online, hoping to find some clue, some pattern, some explanation for why good men simply disappeared without a trace. The years accumulated like dust on forgotten memories, but the questions remained as sharp as ever. Where was John Black Bull Smith? What had happened during those missing hours in November 1995? And why had a man who loved his family more than life itself simply vanished into the Los Angeles night? 25 years had passed since John Black Bull Smith disappeared from Westwood Towers. The Los Angeles of 2020 bore little resemblance to the city he had known. The building itself had undergone extensive renovations, its lobby modernized with sleek glass and steel, erasing most traces of the warm, traditional atmosphere John had once protected. Peter and Marie Clifford had moved into apartment 18C in early 2020, just before the world changed forever. Peter, 35, worked the night shift as a valet at the Beverly Center's luxury parking garage, the same shopping center where John had once maneuvered expensive cars during his day job. Marie, also 35, was a dedicated nurse at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, often returning from her shifts in the early morning hours when the city was still wrapped in darkness. The couple had met in 2015 at a coffee shop near the hospital, bonding over their shared experience of working unconventional hours while the rest of the world slept. Their relationship had been built on quiet moments stolen between shifts, late-night conversations, and the understanding that came from both living life slightly out of sync with everyone else. Their apartment on the 18th floor offered a stunning view of the city, but it was the building's history that fascinated them. Mrs. Henderson, now 87 and one of the few remaining residents from the 1990s, had told them about John during a chance encounter in the elevator. "Nicest man you ever met," she had said, her voice trembling with age and emotion. "Just disappeared one night. Never found out what happened to him. Such a shame. He had a family, you know. A wife and a boy in a wheelchair." The story had haunted Marie, perhaps because her work as a nurse had made her acutely aware of how fragile life could be, how quickly someone could be there one moment and gone the next. On March 15, 2020, as the city began implementing lockdown measures, the building management decided to clean out the basement storage areas to make room for additional package delivery space. Decades of accumulated belongings from former tenants had created a maze of forgotten furniture, boxes, and memories. Peter had volunteered to help with the cleanup, partly out of civic duty, and partly because his valet job had been temporarily suspended due to the pandemic. He found himself working alongside the building's maintenance supervisor, Carlos Mendoza, the same Carlos who had been the evening doorman in 1995 and had spoken to John on his final night. "I remember when this basement was organized," Carlos said, now in his 60s with gray hair and a slight limp. "Back when John was here, everything had its place. That man could find anything down here in the dark." They worked methodically through the storage areas, sorting items into categories: donate, dispose, or return to current residents. In the furthest corner of the basement, behind a stack of water-damaged boxes and a broken exercise bike, Peter's flashlight illuminated something that made him freeze. Hanging on a forgotten coat hook, covered in 25 years of dust and grime, was a navy blue winter uniform coat. The golden buttons had tarnished to a dull bronze, and the Westwood Tower's emblem was barely visible beneath layers of dirt. But what made Peter's breath catch in his throat was the dark stain across the left shoulder and chest area, a stain that had turned brown with age but was unmistakably blood. "Carlos," Peter called softly, his voice echoing in the concrete space. "You need to see this." Carlos approached slowly, his face growing pale as recognition dawned. "Dios mío," he whispered, crossing himself. "That's John's coat. That's his winter uniform." The coat hung there like a ghost from the past, its fabric deteriorated but still recognizable. The name tag, though faded, still read J. Smith in block letters. Peter noticed that the coat's pockets bulged slightly, suggesting something was still inside them. "We can't touch it," Marie said when Peter called her from the basement. She had just returned from her shift and had come down to see what had caused the commotion in her husband's voice. "If this is evidence, we need to call the police immediately." Carlos nodded, his hands shaking slightly. "I was the last person to see him alive. We talked about the weather, about Mrs. Peterson's delivery. He was wearing this coat when I left that night." The discovery sent shockwaves through the building's remaining longtime residents. Mrs. Henderson wept when she heard the news, remembering the kind man who had always helped her with her groceries. Mr. Yamamoto, now 91, shook his head sadly and muttered about how some mysteries were never meant to be solved. But for Peter and Marie, the discovery raised more questions than answers. How had John's coat ended up in the basement? Why had no one found it during previous cleanings or maintenance work? And most disturbing of all, what had caused those dark stains that had soaked into the fabric and remained visible after 25 years? As they waited for the police to arrive, Peter found himself staring at the coat and thinking about the man who had worn it. John Black Bull Smith had been a father, a husband, a man who took pride in his work and cared for his community. He had simply vanished one night, leaving behind a family that had spent decades wondering what had happened to him. Now, hanging in the darkness of a basement storage room, his coat had finally been found. But instead of providing answers, it only deepened the mystery of what had happened during those missing hours in November 1995. The coat swayed slightly in the basement's stale air, as if moved by the ghost of the man who had once worn it with such dignity and pride. Detective Rachel Morrison had seen enough cold cases to know that 25-year-old evidence rarely provided clear answers. The young detective, assigned to the LAPD's cold case unit, arrived at Westwood Towers with a forensics team and a healthy dose of skepticism. But when she saw John's coat hanging in that basement corner, something about the scene unsettled her. "Nobody's touched anything?" she asked Peter and Carlos, who stood watching from a respectful distance. "We called you immediately," Marie replied. "The coat's been hanging there exactly as we found it." Detective Morrison carefully photographed the scene before allowing the forensics team to remove the coat. As they lifted it from the hook, something metallic clinked to the concrete floor, a set of keys that had been hidden in the coat's inner pocket. Carlos gasped. "Those are John's building keys. He always kept them in that pocket." The forensics examination would take weeks, but Detective Morrison knew she had to do something that should have been done 25 years earlier. She had to contact John's family. Rosa Smith, now 68, still lived in the same Inglewood apartment where she had raised Marcus alone. When Detective Morrison knocked on Rosa's door on a gray March afternoon, the older woman's face immediately drained of color. After 25 years, a police visit could only mean one thing. "Mrs. Smith? I'm Detective Morrison with the LAPD Cold Case Unit. We've found something that belonged to your husband." Rosa's legs gave out, and she sank into her favorite armchair, the one positioned by the window where she still watched for John every evening. Marcus, now 37 and working remotely due to the pandemic, wheeled himself into the living room, his face a mixture of hope and dread. "What did you find?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Detective Morrison explained about the coat, the basement, the bloodstains. She watched as 25 years of suppressed grief and desperate hope played across Rosa's weathered face. "He's gone, isn't he?" Rosa whispered. "After all these years of waiting, of believing he might come home, he's really gone." Marcus reached for his mother's hand. "Mama, we don't know that yet. The coat doesn't tell us everything." But Rosa shook her head slowly. "A man doesn't leave his coat behind unless something terrible happened to him. I've known it in my heart for years, but I couldn't let myself believe it." The forensics report, when it came 3 weeks later, confirmed that the blood on the coat was indeed John's. DNA analysis also revealed traces of another person's blood, someone whose identity remained unknown because their DNA wasn't in any database. Detective Morrison visited Rosa again to deliver the news. This time, Marcus was prepared with questions that had been building for 25 years. "What do you think happened to him?" Marcus asked directly. Detective Morrison chose her words carefully. "The evidence suggests your father was involved in some kind of altercation. The location where we found the coat, the condition it was in, it's possible he encountered someone in the building that night who meant him harm." Rosa sat in silence for a long time, staring at a framed photograph of John in his Doorman uniform, the same coat that had been found in the basement. Finally, she spoke. "I need to see where you found it." Against Detective Morrison's advice, Rosa insisted on visiting Westwood Towers. Marcus accompanied her, and Peter and Marie, who had become emotionally invested in the case, offered to meet them there. The basement felt different now, no longer just a storage area, but a place where a mystery had waited in darkness for 25 years. Rosa stood in the corner where the coat had hung, her eyes closed, trying to imagine her husband's final moments. "He was protecting someone," she said suddenly. "John would never hurt anyone, but he would fight to protect the people in this building. That's who he was." Marie found herself crying as she watched this elderly woman confront the reality of her husband's fate. "Mrs. Smith, I'm so sorry. I can't imagine what you've been through." Rosa turned to face the young couple who had discovered her husband's coat. "Don't be sorry, dear. You gave me something I've needed for 25 years. The truth, not knowing, was worse than this." Marcus wheeled closer to the spot where his father's coat had hung. "I used to dream that he would come home one day and explain everything, that there would be some reason, some story that made sense of why he left us." "There is a story," Rosa said softly. "Your father died protecting someone. He died doing what he always did, taking care of people. That's not the ending I wanted, but it's the ending that makes sense. As they prepared to leave the basement, Rosa made a decision that surprised everyone. I don't want to know who hurt him, she said firmly. I don't want to know why or how or what happened to that person afterward. I've spent 25 years consumed by questions. I'm choosing to let them go. Detective Morrison looked puzzled. Mrs. Smith, don't you want justice for your husband? Rosa smiled sadly. Detective, I'm 68 years old. My son is 37. We've built a life around John's absence. Justice won't bring him back, and it won't give us back the years we lost. What I want now is peace. Marcus nodded in agreement. She's right. We know Dad died being the man he always was, someone who helped others. That's enough. As they left Westwood Towers that day, Rosa didn't look back at the building where her husband had vanished. Instead, she looked forward, toward a future where she could finally stop waiting for a man who would never come home. 3 months after the discovery of John's coat, Detective Morrison received an unexpected phone call that would provide the final piece of the puzzle. The caller was Margaret Chen, a 73-year-old former resident of Westwood Towers, who had been living in a nursing home in Pasadena since 2018. I saw the news story about the Doorman's coat, Margaret said, her voice frail but determined. I have something that belongs to his family, something I should have given to the police 25 years ago. Detective Morrison drove to the Sunrise Manor Care Facility, where she found Margaret sitting in her wheelchair by a window overlooking a small garden. The elderly woman's hands shook as she reached into a wooden box beside her bed. I lived in apartment 9A from 1992 to 2015, Margaret began. I was awake that night in November 1995. I heard everything. From the box, she withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. I wrote this letter the morning after John disappeared, but I was too frightened to give it to anyone. I was a single woman living alone, and I was terrified of what might happen if I spoke up. Detective Morrison opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter dated November 16, 1995, written in Margaret's precise script, to whom it may concern. Last night at approximately 3:45 a.m., I was awakened by voices in the hallway outside my apartment. I looked through my peephole and saw our doorman, John, speaking with a man I didn't recognize. The stranger appeared agitated and was gesturing angrily. I heard John say, "Sir, you need to leave the building immediately. I'm calling security." The stranger became more aggressive, and I heard John say, "I won't let you hurt anyone here." There was a scuffle, and I heard John cry out. When I looked again, both men were gone. I was too frightened to open my door. I found blood drops in the hallway the next morning, but they were cleaned up before the police arrived. I believe John was trying to protect us from someone dangerous. Margaret Chen, apartment 9A. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as Detective Morrison finished reading. I've carried this guilt for 25 years. I was a coward. If I had spoken up then, maybe his family would have had answers sooner. Mrs. Chen, why are you coming forward now? Because I'm dying, Margaret said simply. Pancreatic cancer. I have maybe 2 months left, and I can't take this secret with me. That man's family deserves to know the truth. Detective Morrison immediately contacted Rosa and Marcus with the new information. When she read Margaret's letter aloud over the phone, Rosa was quiet for a long moment. So he died protecting the building, Rosa finally said. He died protecting people he barely knew because that's who John was. Margaret insisted on meeting Rosa in person. The encounter took place at the nursing home, with Marcus and Detective Morrison present. The two women, both shaped by the events of that November night in different ways, sat facing each other in Margaret's small room. I'm sorry, Margaret whispered. I'm so sorry I didn't speak up. Maybe if I had. Rosa reached across and took Margaret's trembling hands. You were scared. I understand. But you're speaking up now, and that matters. Your husband was a hero, Margaret continued. He could have just called the police and stayed safe behind his desk. Instead, he confronted a dangerous man to protect the residents. He saved us. Marcus leaned forward in his wheelchair. Do you know what happened to the other man? The one who hurt my father? Margaret shook her head. He was gone by morning. I never saw him again. But I remember his face. Angry. Desperate. He looked like someone running from something. Detective Morrison had already begun investigating, but after 25 years, the trail was impossibly cold. Security footage from nearby buildings had long been destroyed, and without a name or better description, finding the stranger was virtually impossible. 2 weeks later, Margaret Chen passed away peacefully in her sleep. Her final act had been to free herself from a quarter-century of guilt and give John's family the closure they needed. Rosa and Marcus attended Margaret's funeral, sitting in the back of the small chapel as her few remaining relatives said goodbye. After the service, Rosa placed a single white rose on Margaret's casket. "Thank you for telling the truth," she whispered. That evening, Rosa made a decision that surprised Marcus. She drove to Westwood Towers one final time, but instead of standing across the street as she had for years, she walked into the lobby. The current night doorman, a young man named David, greeted her politely. Rosa introduced herself and explained who she was. "Ma'am, I've heard about your husband," David said respectfully. "The older residents still talk about him. They say he was the best doorman this building ever had." Rosa smiled. "He was the best man I ever knew. He died protecting people, and I wanted to thank this building for giving him the chance to be a hero." As Rosa left Westwood Towers for the last time, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 25 years. Peace. John's story was complete now. He hadn't abandoned his family or run away from his responsibilities. He had died doing exactly what she would have expected him to do, protecting others. Marcus found his mother sitting in their living room that night, holding John's photograph. "Are you okay, Mama?" "I'm better than okay," Rosa replied. "I finally know who your father really was. He was exactly the man I married. Brave, selfless, and good. That's how his story ends." Outside their window, Los Angeles continued its restless existence, but inside their small apartment, a 25-year vigil had finally come to an end. John Black Bull Smith was home at last, not in body, but in the peace his family had found in understanding his sacrifice. The mystery was solved, but more importantly, a hero's legacy was finally complete.